And really delighted to be here and to see some faces that I've known for a long time. Jeremy, Bentham, hello. And there are others flipping around the screen here. I think the real foundation of this conversation is Adam and his new book, which is very, I would say, point on for this time in the life of the planet here and us people on it. Um, Adam, could you just briefly tell us about the book? I know some of us learned about this last time, but if you could say what you've learned since the first edition of this book and where you'd like this conversation to land, what would you like to learn from this conversation?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I also see uh, names in the participants of lots of friends. So, hello, friends. Um, and and I wasn't being, I wasn't be, so, and thank you, Betty Sue, for being here. You and I have had so many conversations over the decades through all of this, well, through everything that's happening and through everything that you and I have been writing. So, part of what I'm hoping is to get into this with you as well as with others. When I said when we were standing around, when we were waiting to start, which book are we talking about? I was genuinely confused, and I realized we actually are talking about a different book than I prepared for. But let me just explain. So last year, on November 25th, I published a second edition of a book called Collaborating with the Enemy: How to Work with People You Don't Agree with or Like or Trust. So I'm happy to talk about that, and I can answer your question about what's changed since the first edition, which is a lot. Um, I think the publishers imagined I would make a few tweaks and put a new cover on it, and we'd be done. But I changed it almost completely, and in some senses fundamentally, and it's a lot different and much expanded. But the reason for my confusion is since then I've been working on another book, which is not published, but which is on this question of, yeah, how on earth can we live together? And in particular, this dynamic that has come to my attention between being torn apart, separating, and being smashed together, subordinating, and what possible way, how can we get out of this pattern of ricocheting between separating and subordinating?
But
But
Adam,
anyway, oh,
I think this is the same conversation because
okay.
in a way, the book you're working on now is has to do with collaborating with our enemies. It really does. It's one conversation, don't you think?
Yes. Yes. Well, as you know, I've just written the same book 7 times. So yes, it is a continuation. But uh, okay. So let me say something about collaborating with the enemy, about one of the major changes, which also relates to what you just said.
Yeah.
So I had the good experience in September 2024 of having a writing fellowship in Paris. As you know, I'm not an academic. I haven't been in the university in 40 years, but somehow I got this academic writing fellowship at the Paris Institute for Advanced Study. And on the first day, I presented my project for the month, which was to say that I was working on a new edition of a book called Collaborating with the Enemy: How to Work with People You Don't Agree with or Like or Trust. And one of the academics who was resident there, a Romanian urban historian named Groia Badescu, said, "Adam, your subtitle suggests that this is something extraordinary." And he was right. The subtitle, "How to Work with People You Don't Agree with or Like or Trust," is supposed to sound like this amazing thing, like buy this book because this seems impossible. But Groya's point was, Adam, as urban historians, this is just life in a city. And I found it such a helpful reframing that actually we know a lot, and we have known a lot for a long time about how to live together across difference, including with people we don't know. And if we did know them, we wouldn't agree with or like or trust. And somehow we've gotten into this state or I would say, backed ourselves into a corner that it's impossible, and it takes some superhuman skills and some very advanced books. And in a way, I think that so since the book was published, or as the book was published in November, and as I've spoken about it since, I think this is its most important idea, which is that we have to recover this actually very ordinary capacity to live together with difference. And the fact that we immediately conflate people who are different from us as enemies is the problem. So yes, it's what I'm writing now is a continuation of that idea, but I, I I think what has happened is we've, for lots of very sensible reasons, have fallen into the um, pattern of saying that these people who are different, that we disagree with, that we dislike, we either have to just separate from them, not have anything to do with them, move away, not talk to them, sort ourselves just with people we agree with or like or trust. And as you pointed out in one of our pre-calls, this is easier with the internet because now we can find people we agree with and like and trust all over the world and don't have to deal with all the other people. So we either we separate or we say this is intolerable. These people must get with the program, and if they're not going to do it voluntarily, we'll force them. And we get these patterns of, in the extreme, totalitarianism and genocide. And I realized as I've been working on it the last few weeks that we're toggling between these two extremes, separation and subjugation. And my question is, which is partly answered by the book Collaborating with the Enemy, how do we avoid these two extremes? It really is, I have to say this because I know you are an former English professor. It really is like Scylla and Charybdis. It really is about how to avoid these two extremes and how to find our way through the middle of living together with deep, permanent difference.
And your newest work, um, I guess I could say it responds to what might be an immediate reaction to difference or to conflict, which is either to embrace the other, love, or to control the other, power. But you have found a new middle way between the rock and the hard place, which you call justice. So talk a little bit about that, and then we have a foundation on which to have a
Okay.
conversation.
Okay. So this is a little complicated, but I've uh, been thinking about it and talking with you about it for months and years. So I think I can say it quickly. It's not exactly as you just summarized it. I think faced with a situation which seems chaotic and out of control and dangerous, we have two choices. We can either separate or subordinate. Separating is we just do our own thing. That's what I call power. Just doing our own thing. Now, sometimes that's fine. We just all do our own thing in our own place, and it sort of works. We consider ourselves independent from one another, communities independent from one another, countries independent from one another. But oftentimes, what happens is you're doing your thing, I'm doing my thing, they don't fit, and we end up with a violent conflict. So that's one. So power leads to one, power taken too far leads to one violent outcome. The other, love, the drive to unite, is no, we have to be together. And again, this may work out well, but taken to its extreme, it's that we're all one. You must just stop with this nonsense you're doing, this difference, um, this dissent you have, and we must act like one. And so, taken too far, that leads to authoritarianism. And I think there's what we're seeing now is a vicious cycle between separation and subordination, where the more you try to subordinate people, the more they try to separate themselves. The more they try to separate themselves, the more you try to subordinate them. And so my question is how to get out of that, how to get out of that power without love, which Martin Luther King Jr. said was reckless and abusive, and love without power, sentimental and anemic. And going back to King's work, I'm finally excavating the part that I've never really managed to grasp, but I think I got it by the tail now, which is the the way to the way to deal with this permanent tension between the fact that we're wholes in ourselves and the fact that we're parts of larger wholes. The way to reconcile that permanent universal tension is justice. That's the word King used, the word his teacher Tillich used, the word many people have used. Justice not in the sense of procedural legal matters, but in the sense of the quality of the nature of the relationship amongst us that allows us to be at the same time apart and a part of, apart from, and so anyhow, that's the end of the long, complicated story. But yes, I do think that there is a tension between power doing your own thing and love uniting, and but that the root, the answer to the tension is not let's use more power. It's not let's love each other more. It's actually this third dimension, which is justice. And what I mean by that is a way of relating with one another that enables us to live together well.
What's the unanswered question at the moment then in your mind or your heart? Or have you answered all the questions, Adam? You may have answered all the questions.
Well, I guess the unanswered question is I get it conceptually, but I don't see yet what it looks like.
Yeah.
I don't see yet what it looks like. You said to me when we spoke about it a few months ago, well, yes, yes, it is justice, Adam, but it's much broader than the word is normally used. It includes rules and norms and myths and relationships, kinships. I see John Walton's on the call, who's helped me understand that word kin, the sense of we're a member of the same family. We might not like each other. We might have a lot of disputes, but we do have some reciprocal responsibilities as kin. So it's all of that. And so I get it conceptually. I had this funny experience when I was rewriting Power and Love. After I was in Paris, I had a month in Dubai, and for no particular reason, I just thought it might be interesting. I was there for a conference, and I wanted to talk to people. And the other big change in between the first and second edition of Collaborating with the Enemy is I had a meeting at a robotics laboratory in Dubai, and to make a long story short, when I spoke to the director of the laboratory, I realized that what I'd written in the first edition, that conventional way of collaborating was becoming obsolete, is completely incorrect, and that there's a conventional way of collaborating which involves essentially subordinating the parts to the whole, the team members to the team, and it's not at all obsolete. It's what was going on at that robotics laboratory and every surgical team and sports team and orchestra and work team. But anyhow, so that was a big deal in the rewrite. But at the end of the conference, at the end of this little tour of the lab, I thought this is really fun. I studied physics. I love touring labs. And I said, I have this thing I'm working with on the mathematics of power, love, and justice. Could I come back and talk to you about it? Because there's not a lot of people who you can say, would you like to have
Right.
a mathematical conversation? But they said, yeah, sure. So anyway, I came back at the end of the week and I had they listened to my very obtuse mathematics of this. But one of the guys there was some genius Armenian mathematician said to me, I get it. Justice is the regulator between power and love. And I think he's exactly right. So, but what I mean by justice is what's the way of working together that enables us to both be wholes in ourselves and parts of larger wholes. Without that regulatory mechanism, without that regulator, it's chaos. You just bounce back and forth between separation and subordination. So the answer to your question is I get it conceptually, but I don't see quite how it works. And I'm looking forward to exploring that, well, in this call and over the months to come.
Well, it's interesting you use the word see because when I think of love, for example, I don't think of it just as an action, but a way of seeing the world. So when you say love isn't the answer, I think love is one of the answers because
Yes.
if you see how everything is interconnected, if you see things as a system, and then you see your part in the whole, there's not a subordination to the whole so much as a collaboration with the whole. And to the degree the whole can be harmonized, that's a musical term, the collaboration has power. So
Yeah.
there's a way of doing, which is hard, that's harder to be integrated than seeing. So I
Yeah.
think I'm agreeing with you that the actual action forward is always more complicated than the seeing.
Yeah. So I agree completely. And the way I'm using the word love is the drive to unite the separated, but the seeing involved is exactly what you've said, or it's recognizing and acknowledging that I am not alone here. I am part of larger wholes, communities, organizations, ecologies, um, and acting with that recognition. The opposite of that view would be the view that I'm an individual. I have nothing to do with others. I owe nothing to others. I just must defend myself against others. And and I find that that culture doesn't make sense to me. Um, and I've told you that the most touching example of that, because it was so unexpected to me, is whenever it was 30 years ago when you and I worked together in Houston, which as a Montrealer going to Houston is like going to some other planet. I've never in my life, I've worked in 50 countries and I've never been anywhere where the culture seemed more foreign to me than Houston. Because it is so individualistic and freedom oriented, and the people in the workshop had companies with names like John Smith Interests. This is about me and my interests. And I was so taken with the sense of uh, that twinned with that, we have to look after our community. The Gene Vaughn, the person who the late Gene Vaughn, the person who invited you and me to that works, once got very cross at me. And he said, what kind of person wouldn't acknowledge, I'm not quoting him exactly, but it's what kind of person wouldn't acknowledge the community in which they'd grown up. So I realized that even in, for me, such an extreme place as such an individualistic place, extremely individualistic place like Texas, it's twinned with this sense of, and we're part of wholes to which we have responsibilities. So yes, I understand the power and love part, but the thing I said I couldn't see wasn't the love part, but it's how does justice work? I get conceptually that justice is the regulator, but I don't quite get how it works.
Well, drill
Yeah.
down on that metaphor a little bit because you're a physicist, you know what regulator means. I don't, not all of us are into regulator. What do you mean by that?
Well, uh, I'm a theoretical physicist, so actually I don't know anything about regulators. I think that's more mechanical engineers, which are lower species. But anyway, but I think what he was hinting at, or what I took from that conversation, is uh, you need a way to you need a way to keep in balance everybody doing their own thing, power, and everybody being part of larger wholes, love. And that doesn't just happen by itself. It it requires rules and cultures and norms and stories that keep it from shaking itself apart, as it were.
I want to,
That's how I understood the meaning of regulator.
yeah, I want to introduce something that has a sense so different from regulator, but I think belongs in this conversation, and that's apprehension or intuition or a
Hmm.
feeling. I say that when you because I'm reminded I had a dear friend who was a theoretical physicist. He won the Nobel Prize for co-discoverer of the weak force, and in that work, the practical physicists could not prove his theorem. They failed again and again. And I asked him, I said, Steve, why did they keep doing experiments to prove your theorem since the experiments kept failing? And he looked at me and he said, because it was so beautiful, because the
Hmm.
theory was so beautiful, people kept working. So I think there's a role for vision or the feeling of wanting to make the world a better place or whatever that drive is of intuiting that we could do things differently, that that allows something else to come in and for us to see better ways of doing things. And then the regulator is very important, but I don't want to leave out
Yeah,
this beauty, the intuition
yeah,
of how things fit together somehow.
yeah. I spoke to a friend of mine yesterday named Philip Ativa Solomon, who used to be head of the African American Studies at Yale, and I told him this what I was working on and this idea of justice as a quality of relationship. And he said, I guess you probably don't realize it, but this idea of justice as relationship is a big theme in African American theology. And then he gave me a long list of theologians, only some of whom I knew about, who had taken the idea that justice wasn't just about legal procedures, but about and the close I was looking at some of that this morning, and the closest I came, at least in the first view, to what I'm talking about is when Martin Luther King Jr. talked about the beloved community.
Yes.
So that's a vision of a way of being together. That's the opposite of a community where people are hurting each other or killing each other or staying apart from each other. Um,
Martin Luther King had this idea that if once a week we had dinner with people that we didn't trust or who were different from us, that the world would be a much more peaceful place. And I think
mm,
there's something to that. There's something about breaking bread together. Um, we all need to eat. It's a
yeah.
fundamental thing to keep us alive. And so it reminds us that we are kin, and maybe starting there, we can move forward together.
Mm, mm.
Tamsin, I see that there are questions arising. I don't want to, I can talk with Adam. I have talked with Adam quite a bit over the years, and other people don't have the pleasure of talking with Adam all the time. So it would be nice to hear
But
from,
let me ask you a question first, Betty Sue.
all right.
Uh, because when a few months ago, when I told you I was um, interested in this idea of uh, justice as the means by which we can live well together, um, your first response was, yes, that sounds right, but you have to broaden the meaning of you have to broaden what you're talking about to not just be laws and rules, but you said myths and norms. So so what do you think it takes for us to live together well across what I believe to be big and permanent differences from your perspective?
Well, we have to hold two is paradoxical. We have to hold two things at the same time, which is very difficult to hold. And one is rules and laws. I firmly believe in that. The larger the community, the more norms have to be codified into rules. But on the other hand, if you think how it works in a family with multiple children, um, a family follows Socrates' definition of justice. He said justice was giving each man his due. Notice the man his, but that's another conversation. Giving each man his due, not so much what they earn as what belongs to them. And when you're raising children, you give them what they need for their flourishing, which might be different from case to case. So that is not justice in the sense of equalizing a scale. It's more like
Mm.
it's more like the Egyptian scale of Mott, justice, weighing you at the end of your life, weighing your heart against a feather. It's a different image of what justice is. It's the family, or I would say female image. And the reason I use male and female is that that's the fundamental opposition in our thinking, our binary thinking. We're just designed to think in terms of opposites, light and dark, and which is why, to go off on a theological tangent of a sentence, the original sin was was not disobedience so much as recognizing difference. So they cover themselves up with fig leaves as the first thing they do, which is how God knows they've eaten the apple. So
Mm.
there's something about human beings that we see things in terms of difference. That's how we learn. And so this idea of justice, giving each man his due, or the laws and norms that help us live together in community, very difficult to balance those two things because to some extent they work against each other, or they don't fit mentally.
Right.
Tamsin, I'm looking at you,
So,
although
yeah,
hard
it's
to
okay.
tell. It's hard to tell I am with all these squares, but
Well, I mean, there's so many comments, but in a first theme, let me pick up on some of the justice questions. And I would invite, I can give you the names and who said some interesting things. From Mark has said, how do you define justice? Faison said, from whose lens are you looking? But Douglas in particular looked at questions around justice and the regulator, as did Jeremy. Eileen made some interesting comments. So I wonder if there's somebody, maybe Douglas or Alexis, you want to put up your hand to speak to your questions on justice. The other theme, Adam, that came in was this autonomy and belonging, fear and subjugation, and really how you would see the difference between the me and the we and the dance between those. So, I mean, those are two themes that have come up from multiple people. So if I can invite you to put up your hands because we prefer your voice rather than my reading questions. There you go, Mike. Over to you, Betty Sue.
Mike, I see your
Hi,
hand.
Mike Davis Bird from WeGo, which is Women in Formal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. And I just want to try a quote, a definition, and then maybe one possible response to Adam's point about how to how to get to the justice. So the quote is from Billy Bragg, revolutionary songster of the UK, and he said, "This isn't a court of justice, son. This is a court of law." And the definition is of argument, and it comes from the origin is silver. And before we invented glass, mirrors used to be made of silver. And argument was the act of polishing the glass, polishing the silver, in order to see the reflection more clearly. And
Mm.
argument has become about division, and it never was. The origin of the word is about daring to disagree respectfully. And that for me is how we start to model what justice might look like at an
Mm.
individual level.
Mm.
It's daring to disagree respectfully, and for things not to, for disagreement not to be a rejection of that other
Right.
person.
Yes. That's why the Greeks and Romans came up with rules of argument, like no ad hominem. It's very important to have these ways of being when you argue. I don't know, Adam, what do you think about that?
Uh, well, thank you. It's interesting. And Tamsin, just to go back to how you frame things, I am interested essentially in this dance between me and we, because I strongly believe that we need both, and so the solution of just putting our individual interests aside to me is a non-starter. I use a different pair of words, apart from and a part of, but it's the same idea. Um, um, and yes, the thing that comes to me in what Mike just said is that phrase uh, in Jewish, um, I guess it's Jewish theological argument, which is disagreeing for the sake of heaven.
Yes.
So that it's a different image, but yes, the problem I'm seeing, or an aspect of the problem I'm seeing, is that disagreement has become seen as impossibly difficult, and so just forget it. I either have to separate or I have to subjugate. And so, yes, I think we've lost some of this capacity for dancing between me and we, and for disagreeing productively.
The
You know,
object of argument was finding truth, not beating the opponent.
mm,
So that's for the sake of heaven. If you think
right.
of truth as somehow allied with that. Yes, Douglas.
Morning, all. Thanks for hosting this conversation, and it's good to see you, Adam. So the question that comes up for me, I find myself in a rare position of pushing back at Adam, who I admire enormously and whose work I enjoy enormously, is that if justice is the regulator, then what is it that supports justice in keeping power in its place, so to speak? Because what we're seeing right now in the United States is power just comes in and smashes over everything. It sort of devours everything and leaves devastation in its wake. Um, and so I hear you talking about, you know, norms and webs of relationships, but when you have people come in and smash those down, I'm not sure how justice acts then to regulate between power and love, because power has seized all the levers and wheels of control. You know, not
Yeah.
everything. We see stuff like pushback in Minneapolis, with stuff coming together on a small community-based kind of level. And the one thought that comes up for me is that it's there may be an opportunity, uh, a very difficult opportunity, to create broad spread norms, as we saw in the wake of the Shoah, the Holocaust, following World War II, where there were global norms about what was appropriate and what's not. And what we're seeing in the United States now is an attempt to destroy those norms. So I don't have the answers, but those are my questions or thoughts.
Yeah, I would just say briefly that I think my argument is from the other angle, which is that power by itself is just everybody doing their thing, and in many cases clashing up against each other, and love by itself is everybody must do the same thing, and uh, and dissent and difference suppressed. And what I'm saying is, if that's all you have, you'll end up with separation and or subjugation. And if you want something different, at any scale, and this is important, at any scale, then you also have to pay attention to justice. And so whether you're talking about the scale of the family or the neighborhood or the community or the organization or the country, I'm arguing that's you focus your attention there if you want to dance between me and we. If you don't, if and that requires employing both power and love. But I'm saying yes, if you don't, if you for whatever reason don't see how to get that, then you will end up with separation and or subjugation. And that's
Just
what we have now.
Just yeah, that is what we have now. Just one quick point, because I see Nikki wants to talk. That a spiritual teacher of mine once said the one thing that love cannot overcome is organized crime, and I think there may be something there worth considering. Thank you.
Well, because organized crime is a kind of family.
Thank you, Betty Sue.
It's love at a different scale.
Yes.
It's a sense of
Alexis.
belonging at a different scale.
Yes. Alexis, you're next on my screen, so.
Yeah, I think my questions or my comments are, I'm trying to understand the polarities that you're really looking at. Is it the power and the love? Is it the separation and the togetherness? And what are the benefits of each of those poles? Because I do see benefits. And before I even can start to grapple with the justice piece, I need to really understand more about how you're defining and because I've got I've been working with separation and subjugation as a storyteller all my life. It's really key and core to the work that I do. So I think I have a very different entry point to it. And I'm just really curious to hear more.
Adam, I think that was addressed to you.
Okay, well, I'm very curious about what you've done as a storyteller.
Yes, so am I,
sounds
of
like you're
course.
decades ahead of me. So maybe you could say just a bit more, Alexis, about what separation and subjugation have meant to you, and then I'll answer your
Well,
question.
I can go into my whole story about my multiple cultures and how I've grown up in very collective cultures and very individualistic cultures and also been kind of ping-ponged between those two. But from the storytelling perspective, there's a thought that says that there are only two stories that have ever been told in the world. One is a man goes on an adventure, and the other is a stranger comes to town, which for me kind of sums up this dynamic between the individual going off and doing their own thing and the person coming into a community who is now going to have to subjugate in some way. And I think that might give you enough to then maybe answer my questions. I don't want to talk too long about it.
No,
I could
I'm
forever.
just very interested in what you say, Alexis. I'd love, and I think I might have used the word different than the one I wanted to use. I didn't want to use subjugate. I wanted to use subordinate, because subordinate can be, I can voluntarily subordinate myself. I want to fit into this community. I'm happy to be here, and I'm gonna join in and leave part of my strangeness behind. So without, yeah, I also don't want to, so what's the best way to answer? The way I got into this was through King and his teacher, Paul Tillich, and Tillich's definition of power is the drive everything living to realize itself. So by power, I mean every living being, including every person, every organization, doing their thing for whatever. And often me doing my thing steamrolls over you doing your thing. So, and that's why King said power without love is reckless and abusive. And Tillich went on to say that love is the drive to unite the separated. So the way I've taken this is power is about me being a whole in each of us being a whole in ourselves, doing our thing, trying to get where we're trying to go. And it's different for different people, and love being the fact as Betty Sue said half an hour ago, that we are parts of larger wholes, and that basic and I've written a lot about it. I wrote 20 years ago. I wrote a book called Power and Love, which was about the tension between the permanent tension between I'm a whole in myself and I'm a part of larger wholes. And the only thing I'm doing differently now, 20 years later, is saying that the the way to reconcile those two drives, the way to dance with me and we in Tamsin's language, is surprisingly by focusing on the character of the relationships, for which Tillich and King use the word justice. The form, Tillich says, it's the form that enables both power and love to be exercised. So when Betty Sue asked 15 minutes ago, what's the part of this that I'm grappling with? Conceptually I get it, the form, the regulator, but it shows up in so many different ways. Another way to put it is every society, every group has a different way of answering the question, how can we live together well? I'm in South Africa now. I'm writing in South Africa. Apartheid was an answer to that question. It was an answer that had terrible, brutal consequences, but it was a way of answering that question. South Africa now, I've lived here for 30 years, imperfect in many ways, is still struggling to answer this question. I think nobody's found the perfect permanent answer. But the clue I'm offering is that the answer to the question of how to live together well has to do with the character of our relationships, the form, the structure of that's how we balance the me and the we. But it's permanently out of balance. That's important. There's no stable point.
You can see that watching children learn to walk. It's falling on one side, then falling on another in order to
Yeah.
go forward. Yes, Raj.
And that's
Oh,
the regulatory mechanism. No, that's a very good
that's
example of a talk. Sorry, Raj.
no, but to add to that, the way that you fall from one side to another is that you have a vision of going forward. So the
Mm-hmm.
going
Mm-hmm.
forward is not the balance. The balance is in order to go forward. So there's something
Mm.
about having that vision there that I think is really important. Raj, you're next on my screen.
Thank you. I'm kind of wishing I hadn't raised my hand because I'm finding myself in deep alignment with this conversation and increasing frustration in this conversation. And so it makes my words and energy feel a little clumsy. I want to offer at least one thing that I feel like who I'm channeling right now is Peter Kingsley in his book Reality, and he speaks about the weaving of love and strife. And I feel like that's energy that's alive here, and he frames it in a beautiful mythic way. But I want to offer at least a place where I feel both alignment and frustration, and that is the focus on the individual, even as we say I and we talk about the collective, that the actions are individual, and perhaps that's the only way they can be as individual, right? And it feels really frustrating to me because we're talking about individual behavior change, which is important and so insufficient. And it feels like to me that there's an ontology that's here, and that ontology is global. It is like a large current that captures all of us, our systems, our governance, our the way that we organize, even if we have our own individual cultures that we live in. And that ontology that feels really alive to me, that's strong and often invisible, is the ontology that we're separate from, that we seek domination over and mastery of. That to me is a global ontology that is systemic, that is organizational, that is structural. And it's very hard to then say, well, these are these larger forces of how I'm incentivized, how I'm taught, how I'm to engage in this notion. And so perhaps there's another ontology. And then I wonder, Adam, if there's a different question than the question that this webinar is framed on. But the ontology might be that we're entangled with, not separate from. The ontology might be reciprocity, and that the work might be attunement rather than the ontologies that shape us. So I wonder if the question is not so much what holds us together in a world that is falling apart, but how can we walk through the fire together without internally falling apart? That feels alive to me. Thank you.
I'll respond, and then Adam, I think what you're doing is reframing the question, or at least as I perceive it, so that there's a larger frame around even the human one. Am I incorrect about that, Raj?
It might be. Who knows what I'm thinking? But I do believe that I do believe we're walking through the fire together, and our work is
Yeah.
not to solve or fix the fire, but to figure out how do we actually walk through it together without our internal falling apart and collectively falling apart.
Yes, I have an intuition that we're on the verge, we, humankind, are on the verge of a next discovery similar to the scientific discovery. In this case, how we are attuned to some larger vision that we have not yet organized ourselves around. The scientific revolution was incredible in that it resulted in the world we live in now, finding principles of science that could be used to create technology. We haven't done that with ourselves yet, how we can flourish as human beings. It takes a different frame of thought. We haven't gotten there yet, but I think I'm in attunement with where you're going with what you're saying. But Adam, speak up on this since it was really addressed to you.
Well, just briefly, yes, I think in shorthand, it sounds like I'm talking only about individuals, but my interest is in how this plays out literally at all scales. And I'm concerned about apartness and subordination in international affairs and in family matters and in ecological matters. So I probably do default to talking about individuals, but that's not what I mean. I'm talking about social systems at all scales. But I think more fundamentally, what I'm trying to do may end up in the same place, Raj, but I'm deliberately getting there in two steps. So when I say, this is the working title of the new book for this week, The Justice Solution, I am ending up with focusing on how we are together and specifically the word reciprocity and entanglement. But I really want to get there by talking about wholes that are apart from each other and wholes that are a part of each other. Betty Sue and I had a wonderful time, I guess it was 15 years ago, working with a Chilean diplomat. And when Chilean diplomats are angry with you, they always say, they start every sentence, insisto, I insist. Anyway, like 100% of sentences at a certain point started with I insist. So what I'm saying is I insist that we also acknowledge the way in which we are apart from each other and a part of larger wholes, but not jump to simple entanglement, because I think the skipping over the sense of apartness, the sense of individuality, the sense of competition, the sense of self-realization, the imperative of self-realization that Tillich referred to, leaves you unable to understand what's happening in the world. I would argue you can't understand any day's news if you don't understand power. So I want to start there. I insist on starting there, but I'm ending, I think, in the same place as you, Raj, which is that that the way we deal with our interrelatedness, our kinship, our entanglement is the solution through the mess.
Mark, you've had your hand up very patiently.
Thank you. I've really learned far more than I can impart now. But what I would like to say is that in the good old days, we used to look for common ground. That was our way of expressing simplistically what we're discussing today. And there's been discussion of religious concepts that extend back 3, 4, 5,000 years. But there is another source that I think is worth taking into account, and that is martial arts, not because they involve conflict, but rather because they were the source of many of the practices today that people utilize to find peace and balance. Tai Chi is my choice. Others use Taekwondo or karate, but the basic concept that Qi is energy and that channeling the Qi to achieve objectives is something we all have in common, just like eating. And the question that I want to pose is, isn't it possible that the life force itself, the Qi itself, is something to be explored as common ground, that something we all share, something we all deal with, whether we use martial arts forms or whether we just do whatever comes into our heads. There's certainly some people that do that. I think that the life force itself includes a flow of energy through each of us, and that is potentially common ground. Thank you.
Juanita, why don't you put your voice in here, and then we'll see if there's a way to incorporate what Mark has just said, as well as what you're saying. You're on
You're
mute,
on mute,
Juanita.
Juanita.
I think I'm on a slightly different thread. Hi, Adam. It's been a long time.
Hi, Juanita. Yes.
I was thinking actually, as we were reflecting, and you were reflecting on what's needed at different scales, like the relationship between intimacy and scale, about a time that we spent with Umberto Maturana with the MIT Organizational Learning Center, where he described love as the co-arising of the legitimate other. And whether through storytelling, conversation, whatever allows that kind of relational field to evolve feels like justice to me, whatever we might think of as justice. Having spent many years as an adversarial nonviolent activist in the Gandhi and Cesar Chavez tradition, I'm really asking myself now, at the practical level, what are the practices that enable that the description that you're giving, Adam, of justice as that kind of middle space, the practices that actually enable that to happen, depending on what context each of us is working in. I'm right now in a small town in southern Appalachia, in the south of the United States. And that has a very different kind of, at some level, a different character than working with a multinational corporation or working in South Africa or wherever our lives take us. So I have an interest and a question in how and what are the actual embodied and engaged practices that enable this quality, these various names that we've given to that quality of possibility as we walk through the fire together.
Maybe Jerry also.
Okay.
I was just very intrigued by this idea of justice and I was very excited when Raj talked about reciprocity because for me, um, let me say this with all due respect. Most of the people in this room are Westerners, people who've come through a Western education system and have a very particular way of looking at the world. I come from a very different tradition. My tradition is one where reciprocity rules the day. You couldn't imagine somebody getting to a school or to a university or to a healthcare system or to manage the payment of certain fees without reciprocity in the community. And reciprocity for me is actually, it's all about in the home, who does the washing up, who cleans the toilet, who is, we are very high, we have a very highly tuned brain to when we think things are unfair. And I think this is such an important driving principle, not just as individuals, but also in groups, in communities, that we keep forgetting how important reciprocity is and how, in fact, when reciprocity is, I think Raj said, always in imbalance, that's where the tension is. It's always trying to refight that battle. And I'm conscious of the fact that we never talk about reciprocity in that way. We sort of it's an add-on at the other side. Instead of it's actually the driving principle. And I can't think of a society I've lived in or studied, I mean, I'm an anthropologist, where reciprocity hasn't been at the core of dispute, of settlement, of conflict, of peacemaking. It's at the end, it's about peace. And if one were to say, look, for example, at Mozambique and how peace was achieved there independently by people making very tactical decisions, the amount of reciprocal negotiations that were going on at village level to forgive children that had actually burnt their own parents' houses was formidable. And what was driving it was reciprocity. So I'm just wondering if reciprocity or I don't know whether there is such a thing, but justice and reciprocity together is closer than the notion of rules that are established from outside to regulate tension, rather than rules that you generate because you need to live with others.
Jerry, say one more sentence about the Mozambique. How is reciprocity involved in those parents?
Well, I mean, in the end, when people moved from Malawi to, I think, in fact, it was Mike that was reminding me of this the other day. When the end of the war came, it came because people made the decision to move, and they moved in very interesting ways. They just moved, and all the agencies and everybody that was trying to deal with it had to catch up with them. And one of the things that happened is that women who were responsible for making sure that kids could be forgiven for having committed atrocities, they ended up inventing culture, inventing solutions so that they were able to forgive one another. And people then went back into the villages. It was an extraordinary experience. And it's very funny. We always talk about South Africa and the truth and reconciliation work that went on. We very rarely talk about Mozambican mothers who did anything of any significance. And yet, frankly, it was probably the most successful peacemaking I've ever seen.
When the aim is peace and not power, you can be much more imaginative in devising solutions, it seems to me. Adam, do you want to thread all these things together?
Well, I'd like to say some things, but also not try to pretend to understand things I don't. So I'm interested in the martial arts connection, although I don't know much about it, but I'd call out my late teacher, Wendy Palmer, who I think some of you know, who was an Aikido teacher and who said to me, Adam, you talk a lot about power and love, but I know what they feel like in the body. So I'm sure there's lots to learn from that discipline that I don't know about. And yes, hello, Juanita. I am interested in this question of what's the embodied practice. And when Betty Sue said, "What's the part you don't understand?" That's the part I'm still searching for. Jerry, thank you very much. I do agree that the word reciprocity is central, absolutely central. And Betty Sue has pointed out to me that when I'm really making my own life difficult by choosing to use the words power, love, and justice, because they have so many different connotations and definitions. And so it's actually easy for people to think I'm talking about something different than what I'm talking about. So that's a whole other story. But when I'm using the word justice to talk about reciprocal interrelationships, not rules imposed from outside. So thank you for bringing that word in. I picked up a book, quite a thick book by Amartya Sen, which is called, I think it's called Justice, no, it's called The Idea of Justice. And it is an academic text, but sorry, I'm trying to find can't now find what I wanted to read to you. But the very first sentence of the book, I think echoes what you're saying, Jerry, about how this this sense of reciprocity and fairness is foundational. And the very first sentence in the Sen book is, "In the little world in which children have their existence," says Pip in Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, "there is nothing so finely perceived and finely felt as injustice." And Sen goes on to say, "The strong perception of manifest injustice applies to adult human beings as well. What moves us reasonably enough is not the realization that the world falls short of being completely just, which few of us expect, but that there are clearly remediable injustices around us that we want to eliminate." So I think this, where I'm coming to, maybe I'm 80% of the way there, maybe I'm 5% of the way there, but anyhow, where I've come to so far is that there's there aren't cases, ideal cases of justice, but the drive to deal with clearly remediable injustices is the core challenge to the mess we're in, at all scales. If we don't deal with that, then we will continue with what we have. So that's how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah. Tamsin, you have an intervention here.
I just want to raise some questions and invite these people to speak if they would like to. So if you would like to, please put up your hand. I'm not necessarily going to make you, but Heather, on reciprocity and on various other questions you raised, would you like to Mary Alice, I'm very sorry that Adam attributed the me to we to me. It did emerge from you, but Adam knows it from me in another context. And I also see you've had a number of other questions, so I don't know if you wanted to say something. Sarah Dawn, I was looking at your comment, Dave Pendle and Dylan Terry. So would any of you like to, because you were speaking on this thread, and particularly Heather around the reciprocity, I will leave it there without forcing anyone.
Thanks, Tamsin. Hello, everyone. I'm Heather Ramackle. I mentioned in the chat that I'm hailing from Greater Victoria, the territory of the Kwanghan-speaking peoples. And Yeah, I've definitely been wrestling with so many pieces of the conversation that have happened today. I'm currently on sabbatical from 20 years of being a public servant. I'm a geographer. I found myself accidentally in the technology realm, but mostly focused on people. And people trying to make decisions about how to create fair, just, equitable, accessible services with a lot of internal organizational dynamics that don't set us up for success. And so, Adam, I've been following your work for many years. I think 2009 is when I started reading your works. And I've recently, the question of reciprocity was just so important for me because something that we had to do in government to change the way that we were building teams to focus on solving real problems was to create the space where people felt that they could equally show up and that there was a sense of appreciation for who they were and what they were bringing, and that they were also welcome to bring other perspectives and other people into the space. And I think that you need in government where it's very hierarchical, where there's not a sense of that, where rank and position really diminishes people's ability to show up. Everyone had to find a way to contribute. So I, as a senior leader in the space, was emptying the dishwasher and making coffees, right? Like things like that, just to show that we were, equally at the table, that there was a sense of service to each other was really important. So, when I heard, reciprocity, it's a very different scale, just like trying to create small groups of people to solve problems together, that we just have those daily interactions that create a sense of, hey, there's something that we can do to feel equal at the table. And also the notion of practices that was brought up earlier, I think that's where my head is at. And so, Adam, listening to you speak to this question of how do we, what can we learn about where justice emerges, perhaps, about what are those conditions, what are the things that are happening, and where do we find some common patterns that we can sort of say, hey, we have a lack of justice over here. Let's maybe take from the library of ways to create justice in a space where there's, we're imbalanced. And I myself have been asked many times to answer the question because I, as a facilitator, just weaving through the world, I've been able to figure out ways to do that. And so I've recently been developing sort of an open model, a framework to sort of say, here are the patterns I've been noticing, and they kind of magically fell together in a bit of a palette of different things that we might, as a group of people with diverse views, pay attention to. And it's very much in my context. So back to being context specific. And so I think I'm really wrestling. So I don't really have like a specific comment or question, but I'm really wrestling with this idea of like, where are those patterns? How might we as a collective bring those together and sort of say, is there something, even just a set of things that could start to work away at that pile of easily solvable injustices? Because I think that's where I want to work. That's where I want to spend my next 10 years, is just finding a space to really contribute to that. So thank you all for like broadening my perspective on this. And martial arts is also oddly something I've started to be interested in my year off. So I'm going to start looking into that more.
Mary Alice.
Thank you so much. When Alexa said I'm a storyteller, my ears perked up, of course. So my question is, Adam, what do you think are the narratives that are underneath the struggle that we're having currently? And where my mind is going is I feel like Hollywood particularly has been pumping out the hero's journey excessively, and the business community has been excessively dealing with it, but it's such a flat version. The original reason behind the hero's journey was so the hero could bring the boon back to the community. And that's by far the hardest thing to do. And that's why that's never really covered. It's covered in the end of Lord of the Rings when Frodo goes to the West with Gandalf because he can't actually be there anymore. This is what happens. You don't fit anymore, right? But even Campbell said, I've studied the men's stories. You never studied the women's stories. And women's stories are often more about the collective and how do things get shared. So I feel like this whole area has led us into really black and white thinking, which is this good and evil are easily figured out. It's them over there. So what do you think is the narrative that's happening? And I get it too when you say I get justice conceptually, because that's where we need stories. We need the universal to give us the specific and the specific to help us see the universal. And that it feels like currently a failure of storytelling or a failure of narrative. What are your thoughts?
Well, I have one firm rule in life, which is that all questions about myth and storytelling and Joseph Campbell, I defer to Betty Sue Flowers. Professor?
I think you're absolutely right that we don't have a big story anymore. The hero story is very good. At the end of his life, Campbell was looking into the women's side of things with the hero's journey. And then he ended up going back to the great goddess mythology because we've sort of forgotten that. Even in the Jewish temple, until just, I forget which one came and tore down all the goddess poles that were there. Ahura was her name, I think, Ahursa. Anyway, there are all these goddess mythologies, and they have a completely different underlying trajectory of story, not so much in time. The hero's journey, which again, I think applies to every human being because we live in time. We're born and we die, and it's a linear thing. But the goddess material is not linear. It's really about death and rebirth and death and rebirth. It's about the seasons. It's about the phases of the moon. It's about transformation. And that is just dropped out of consciousness, speaking over broadly here. But until PBS or CPB was recently demolished in the US, we were going to work on that. There was a thing called Goddesses and Heroines that I was working on a film, which is no more. But that I think you're absolutely right. The stories of the goddess and what that means, which is rebirth, back and forth and cyclical, need to enter in and join with the hero story, which is also still very applicable. I don't know if that responds to your question, but Dylan.
Hi, I'm joining from London, and I just wanted to, it's not really a question, but a comment, and maybe to think about is, I recently read an article about the importance of relational intelligence in the AI era, and that it'll almost replace IQ and EQ as the kind of key assets for humans, especially as AI is able to replicate IQ and EQ. And it made me think of it because, Adam, when you were describing the concept of justice really being about the nature of relationships and the article had described relational intelligence as navigating tension, repairing ruptures, creating meaning with others. And it just made me think about, I've seen a few comments as well about the role of technology in pushing either subordination or separation to the extremes. And as more people rely on technology and AI especially, potentially there is really something around this kind of relational intelligence and how the lack of that or the lack of kind of developing that will lead us towards these extremes of the kind of love and power dynamic that you described.
What are we humans for? Yes. Adam, sorry, I interrupted you. I just
No.
thought it's
yes, I just wanted to thank you, Heather, for that work that you described. And I mean, my simplistic answer to your question, Mary Alice, or one part of the answer is we're dealing with a dominant myth that of separation and of that we're separate and that might equals right. I mean, these are not new observations, but that's what I see repeating over and over. So I'll just offer another image, and this is a story that doesn't have a neat conclusion, but it is the story, Betty Sue, you'll recall that I told you probably a year and a half ago, which is what's ended up in this new book project, which is that about a year and a half ago, I was in Melbourne working with a group of Aboriginal people on issues related to Aboriginal life in Australia. This was before the referendum that ultimately failed, involving people who were involved in the treaty process, which ultimately or has since succeeded. But I noticed something very particular about the meeting. We had a large meeting at the end of the week of people who didn't know each other. And I'm sure many of you have seen this in other contexts, including in North America. But what I found striking is that when people introduced themselves, they didn't do what is common in many Western circles, which is their name and their organization and their position. But they 100% of them introduced themselves by saying their lineage and their location, and which I found striking, just because it's so different from in thousands of meetings. This is I'm so and so from this people and that people. My mother's people are from here on this side of the river, etc. And this went around for it was quite a large group, so this took about an hour. And I was the last to speak, and at the time, I'm sure still now, there was a lot of conflict over Gaza between Aboriginal organizations and Jewish organizations in Australia, for reasons I won't go into. But I decided, look, everybody's saying where they're from, and I'm Jewish, so I introduced myself by my Jewish name, which I never use in such settings, and which includes my tribal language, the tribe of Kahane, the tribe of priests. And I was a little nervous to do that because of this conflict that was going on. Anyhow, the meeting proceeded, and then after the meeting had ended, we broke for lunch, and I sat next to one of the women I've been working with all week, and I said, "Was that okay? I mean, was that okay what I did?" I was a little nervous that this was inappropriate in some way, and her answer was simply, "Welcome to relationship." And I think what she was trying to tell me, I'm going to go back and ask her again, or I've asked her by email. I'm going to go back, look at the answer. But I think the idea of that way of introducing yourself is that we have to start by understanding where we're all coming from, literally. And somebody later explained to me, I mean, there's many of us in this room have long histories of conflict amongst your people and my people. And so it's not just a sweet thing to do, it's also partly warning you, I'm from this group, so we care about this stuff. And so, but I'm just taken by this this Aboriginal idea of starting with place, starting with relationship, and only when we know that can we begin to figure out how are we gonna deal with what we're dealing with. So, as I say, this is a story that doesn't have a neat moral, but I keep coming back to it in my mind as a key part of this story. So I'm curious, Betty Sue, what does that story mean to you now in the context of this conversation? We spoke about it in another context a year and a half ago.
Well, in the South, we're always positioned by where we're from and what our family is. And you have to kind of make that clear. Are you Paul Davis's eldest child from Maddie Corley? Or are you where are you situated in your clan and your place? I think that now that so many of us move all over the place all the time, that's not as, I just wonder when we're not situated in the same place all our lives, what that does to our sense of groundedness. What are we grounded in? And we make our own communities. So how do we articulate that? So that's what arises in my mind from what you say. I don't know. I think we're in the same family, Adam, but I haven't figured out what the lineage is.
Adam, I wonder if you've read Patty Kravik's book on becoming kin. You might find it quite interesting because she talks about unforgetting, which feels like it's something that is implicit in what you just said. I know we are almost out of time, so I don't know if both of you would like to just give last thoughts. If there's anybody else who'd like to put up their hand and make any last comment, as I have said, we will share the notes and the recording with everybody. And I'm personally hugely grateful. Thank you all for coming, and thank you so much, Betty Sue and Adam. So over to the two of you for any.
Adam, we never expect a final thought from you. What is a current thought right this moment?
I think it would have been easier to talk about a book that was finished, as you suggested at the outset, rather than a book that's. But I am grateful, and I do have the sense that there's something worth saying here about justice and reciprocity and relationship as the not obvious necessities for dealing with our problematique. What about you?
I was thinking of the character of two men that you knew well, and Nelson Mandela particularly, and what a difference character makes too. Soul. We haven't used those terms, but we can be inspired by the soul of an individual. And I just thought it'd be a nice ending to hear you talk about Mandela and his influence in your life.
Well, I never met Mr. Mandela.
Right.
But in as much as I immigrated to South Africa in 1993 and have lived here ever since then. He's around me all the time. Last year I had a meeting about something else with the head of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and when we were leaving, I asked him a question that I knew he'd have an answer to. I knew he'd been asked it 100 times, which is, what do you say to people who think that Mandela sold out, which is an often repeated phrase in South Africa.
Yeah.
And he said, well, he answered like somebody who'd answered this question many times before. He said, this was a negotiated solution. So what part of negotiated don't you get? You don't get everything you want. So leaving aside, what was done right or wrong then or since in South Africa, I think we're driven by dreams of total victory. This is something Insulza said, our Chilean friend. He was talking about Venezuela. This was years ago, but he wasn't generally somebody who gave very heroic speeches or whatever the word is. But he said in this op-ed about at the time of Chavez, the desire to have a heroic ending to this story is really a bad idea. So I think this desire that we're going to just vanquish these people once and for all, we're going to get everything we want. I mean, sometimes that works, but mostly most of us, most of the time, are in the situation Mandela was in, which is there's a balance of forces here, a balance of power, and we have to try to find a way forward. It's going to be a compromise, and that's gone out of fashion. But that's what when I first wrote Collaborating with the Enemy, my publisher said, nobody wants a book about collaboration. It sounds like it's about compromise. I said, well, it is about compromise.
That's right.
Sorry, I can't help you with that one. So anyhow, for me, it's just what's so clear to me is the difference between I'm going to get whatever I want, even if I have to just bomb everything, compared to I'm not going to get everything I want. This is really not going to work well in all respects. But we've got to find a way forward that doesn't involve separation or subordination. So that's what I learned from Mandela at a distance.
And he learned something from you, or he would not have said to Sanchez, go to Adam to figure out what to do about the future of your country. So I think there's a lot to be said for what you've given to the world, Adam, and I'm really eager for this new book.
Thank you.
Terry, you have your hand raised. Terry, did you want to say something? Your hand is raised.
I apologize. That was unintentional, and unless you want an anecdote, I will shut up. I apologize.
Well, thank you, most especially Betty Sue and Adam, and that insight. And I loved Dorothy's framing of your question at the end, Betty Sue, about what is your freshest thought, not what is your last thought. So I wish you a day of fresh thoughts. And Adam, I hope you don't spend all night with your mind whirring with this. I'm sure a lot of us will. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for the help with this
Yes.
work in progress. I will study the transcript carefully.
See you next time, everyone.